Hello, I'm Danielle Smith, president of the Alberta Enterprise Group, and I am collaborating with Common Sense Calgary to interview candidates for the upcoming civic election on October the 18th. Joining me now is your candidate for Ward 5, Tudor Dinca. Tudor, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you very much for having me, Mrs. Smith, and I'm looking forward to sharing my ideas with the audience of Common Sense Calgary.
Well, let's find out a little bit about you. First of all, why don't you tell us what your background is and why you think that would make you a good candidate for council?
Absolutely. So my name is Tudor Dinca. I am actually an immigrant from Romania. I came to Canada in 2001. I was 13 at the time. And besides first few months where my family rented an apartment in Ranchlands, the first home that my family purchased in Calgary was actually in Castleridge. So I spent all of my teenage years and a lot of my young adulthood in the Northeast. And that's really the big reason why I'm running in that area, because I feel the area part of the city gets neglected often, or at the very least, even when it gets projects, if they are secondhand quality or the public service delivery is not on the same level. Based on that experience, I ran in 2017 for the first time, try to bring some of those issues to bear. I obviously did not win. Councillor Shahal is the one that won in that race. But afterwards, I did get an interview with the local MP. I worked for him for 2 years. Then afterwards, I worked 6-7 months with the MLA. And I really got to see even more the issues and how the dynamics in the communities operate on all the different levels of government. And I also kept a close eye on what happened at City Council. And I still think some of the issues that I talked about in 2017 have not been addressed almost at all. And I think it's worth me coming back and being another voice in the race for City Council.
Well, then let's talk about that. What would you have done differently if you had won instead of George Shahal? He, up until a few weeks ago, he was going to be the incumbent. And so give me some idea of what you think is neglected and what you would have done differently.
Well, a big talking point for me is in regards to the LRT extension further up into the Northeast. In 2017, as today, a big talking point was the Green Line. But I really wanted to point out to people that although the media, the mayoral candidates were discussing the Green Line, there was next to no conversation about extending the Blue Line further up into the Northeast. As you may know, the LRT in the Northeast goes up to Saddletown. And in 2012, when the city had estimated how much it would cost to extend it to 128 further up into the Northeast, where Redstone and Skyview are, the cost estimate was $355 million for 7.5 kilometer of track. The most recent estimates in November 2020 has already the same project for almost the exact same distance at $730 million. So double the cost. And I made the point in 2017 when I ran that if we don't at least start talking about the project, start building it in stages, we're going to keep building new communities, new roads, new utilities, and other obstacles that are going to increase the cost of this project. And the reality is, if you look at the Green Line, it's so expensive for a number of reasons. I think part of that was, in my opinion, not the ideal political negotiations between the different levels of government. But there are unexpected costs because, you're expropriating land in old neighborhoods. You have to move utilities in old neighborhoods. You have a change of elevation when you're going from downtown up to north central Calgary, and a plethora of other reasons. But that's why it's so expensive. But when you look into Northeast Calgary, if you were to live in that area in 2017, there was a lot of open space. There were no new communities. There were no utilities. There were no roads. So the cost per kilometer is significantly smaller than the cost per kilometer for the Green Line. And unfortunately, that was not taken advantage of as a talking point. Not to mention that if you look at the planning for the line, I was the only person who talked about it in 2017. Councillor Shahal picked it up in 2018, 2019. He talked about it a little bit, but the city has not touched the design plan since March 2019. That's the most recent one.
Well, let me ask you, I think I just need you to connect this because I was going to ask you a question about the Green Line anyway, but I may as well ask it now then, because it started off as a project that was supposed to serve North and South. It had buy-in, multi-levels of government. It was going to be fully funded for 40 kilometers, and now it's not the same project it started out as. So I'm wondering, are you saying that the Green Line should be scrapped in favor of the project you're proposing? Do you think that both can be done? Do you think that there is a different approach that should be taken to transit altogether, since these projects are escalating as high as they are? Just give me your sense of how this fits into the bigger picture.
Absolutely. So, the LRT is part of my bigger umbrella topic, which is city planning or urban planning. A lot of our issues when it comes to property taxes increase or how we manage our public services is because we have such a poor history over the decades of planning our city. We keep sprawling, but we are not able to deliver the same services as we stretch the tax base. And we think we can cover those gaps in our service delivery by increasing property taxes, which hurts the average taxpayer. But in regards to your question to the blue line and green line, the reality is, I think the southeast leg is very doable because initially it was supposed to be a BRT. The land has been already expropriated. The route is pretty good, but I do think that once you get out of downtown North Central, I think the new route is a horrible design. I'm not going to hold back. I've been very fortunate to travel around the world, places like Singapore, Holland, Germany, other places. And I really take the time to look at the public transportation and the urban development. And what we're doing on what we want to do on Center Street is a very outdated model. No places in the world that have the best public transportation do they go with that. Now, to be fair, that would be a bit more expensive. But the reality is we try to save money in the city in the short term, and we might. But in the long term, we're going to pay way more. And that's not just in the cost, that's in maintenance. And more importantly, in the time of every single Calgarian that is stuck in traffic because of poor design, that has to deal with like snow blocking the train tracks or other issues like that. And that's something that sometimes we don't factor into our cost estimates.
All right. We're going to return in a minute to talking a little bit more about capital programs, but I want to try to just take it back a bit so that we can talk about the broad framework. Because a lot of what you would do when you get elected is to give direction to administration. And I want to just get your sense of that. How do you think that relationship should work between the elected council member and the administration? So many decisions are administration led, with the board being more of a governance body. You seem to have a lot of ideas that would get you down into the details. So how do you think that would work? Do you think that the board, do you think the current council is operating the right way, or would you change things?
Yeah, it's a very difficult, in reality, this is what often is referred to as the principal and agent idea, which as me as a counselor, I can present the issues to the community and I can, to the administration and the vision that I have and what I think would be the best one. But then the agent takes your idea, takes the project, shapes it from their experience. They're like, well, I've worked in this area for this amount of time, and they kind of shape it in their perspective. Then they bring it back to me, and then it would be a tug of war. And that would be the compromise. And this is the reality. And I think I do have a good set of negotiation skills. I have a good set of knowledge skills, experiences to present on how we have to think differently at the city. I'm a big fan of history. And the reality is Calgary has had two major periods. One is the pre-Leduc period and one is the post-Leduc period. Until 1950, our city was very influenced by the Anglo-Saxon idea of urban planning and design. We actually had a quite vibrant, not super vibrant because we went through a stagnation between 1920 and 1945, but we had a very British looking kind of downtown. Then after 1950, because we had so much oil, we had mayors like Don McKay and Mr. Harry Hayes that actually looked at the American Midwest and Texas specifically and how to extract our oil and how to evolve as a city. And what we did there, although it did help us in extracting oil and getting our oil to more markets, it actually gave us some bad lessons when it came to urban planning. So we shifted from maybe sustainable development to sprawl and car-centric. That's why a lot of our city is so road-based and car-based, because if you ever go down to Texas, Houston, Dallas, it's the same thing. But again, we had some short-sightedness. So for example, maybe a lot of your viewers don't know, but until 1950, Calgary actually had a very developed streetcar network that covered a good amount of its area. And then we took it out, we put in trolleys, but then we woke up 25 years later and we're like, maybe we need a light rail transit. But it was a light rail transit modeled after the American one, not the European or the Japanese one. Again, it was the American one. And now we have a green line and we're trying to build even more rail, trying to get back what we had before.
Okay, I appreciate everything you're saying. It's such an interesting look back on history, but here's the problem. You're inheriting the situation you've got now. So if we were to look at this new era of development, what's your model? Where would you look to?
Yeah, so my biggest step first would be we have to really cut down as much as we can sprawl. We have to understand that we can't keep stretching because it's exceptionally hard to administer. If Calgary wants to enter the club of the top 3 cities in Calgary, which are Vancouver, Montreal, and Toronto, if you look at those cities, for example, you have Vancouver, North Vancouver, Richmond, and Burnaby. Surface area-wise, you could fit all those 4 areas that I just mentioned in Calgary's footprint, just to get an idea of scale. But the difference is all those 4 areas have their own city hall, their own city administration. Right? They understood that once you get too big, it becomes hard for you to administer, unless, of course, like you raise taxes and you do all these kind of other measures to kind of make up for that gap. But again, we don't want to burden the average taxpayer again and again and again and again over the years. So we have to draw a line, see what we've done wrong so far, because the people have to understand all these new communities that we're building, every new community becomes an old community. And in 20, 30 years, unless we have another economic boom, which is not a guarantee with the boom and bust that we've had in the past, we're going to end up having to pay even more for the maintenance of those roads and maintenance of those neighborhoods. And if we don't draw a line to know, okay, what can we deal? How can we help increase densities in areas so we can increase our taxpayer base, so we can deliver these services and these expectations from the Calgary taxpayer? We should really not approve any new communities. And if I might add, because I have seen questions from you in the past from other interviews about the 4 major projects in the city. An example.
Hold on. No, before you go there, let's stay on this one for a minute.
No, I will. I'm just giving you as
you're sort of stacking your answers, so I just want to make sure that we're able to deal with this issue that you're talking about before we move on to the next one. Because here's the issue is that if you do not allow for new greenfield development, people are just going to move to Cochrane or Okotoks or Strathmore or Airdrie, and you don't get that tax base anyway. So do you think that there might be a flaw in your approach? Because then all of the tax revenues go to an adjacent community, but those are likely to be commuters into Calgary. So I'm just wondering if you might need a little bit more balance.
Yeah. So again, I'm not saying scrap everything, but definitely we have to downsize the scale. Again, and we can look inside within our boundaries. Again, because I love history so much, I was reading a book for the 100-year anniversary of Calgary, 1975. And one of the big topics at the time was the province wishing to make other municipalities in the city bigger, because Calgary and Edmonton are growing so much, they're becoming the epicenters, and they already are the epicenters of the province. But the problem is, as soon as you get a bust, as soon as these cities bust, right, the whole economy suffers as a result of it. So the province should be looking at how to increase other municipalities so that we have a better balance, better distribution, more opportunity for creativity all across the province.
Okay.
So I don't think other municipalities getting bigger is a big problem. It's how they manage that growth.
Okay. Let me then sort of bridge into talking about the vibrancy of downtown, because we've got a huge downtown vacancy problem. And I'm just wondering how that fits in to the vision that you're proposing. What would you do differently?
Yeah, so, again, historically in the 80s is when we had a really big dip economically. But what the city managed to do as oil prices start climbing up over time, they did a great job of attracting head offices into Calgary. So I think CPR, if I'm not mistaken, TELUS. There were other companies that in the 90s and the early 2000s, they really moved their head offices here because there were probably preferential, tax schemes for them to do so. And we have to do that. But it goes hand in hand because it goes hand in hand with how attractive you make downtown. Downtown, unless it's the summer, unless it's the weekend, is pretty empty after 5 p.m. It's not an attractive place to go. And if you go in cities like Vancouver or Toronto, the reason a lot of young people in my demographic want to live there is, besides restaurants, which we have, that's not a problem, they have better public spaces, basketball courts, green spaces, places to do activity. In fact, I'm not sure if you saw, but they recently opened downtown a superstore, a grocery store. Before, you had really limited option. I think one Safeway, you had to go into Kensington to do your grocery shopping. Whereas in places like Toronto, as they're building these residential and these businesses, they are making kind of shopping and all these other activities that are essential for you to want to live downtown accessible. And we don't have that in our design of our downtown area.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about the economy. How do you get the economy moving again? Because that is a good strategy, I think, for making downtown more livable. But how do you attract more businesses, either downtown or to the city as a whole? There's different approaches you can take. You can reduce taxes, offer tax holidays, you can reduce regulation, or you could do what the Calgary Economic Development Authority has been empowered to do, give them $100 million grant, and then they can use dollars to attract businesses here. What would be your preference?
No, for sure. As we know, humans run on incentives, so we want to encourage that absolutely. The tax breaks for in property taxes or in other type of incentives would help that, because in the end we have to diversify our economy, and we actually are very lucky because we have a very highly educated population in the city. We have to incentivize innovation. We are becoming incredibly digital in the world. Anything that might come from data processing, IT, anything like that, we have to see how we can expand those areas so that they can open up offices in our existing spaces. We're not lacking the infrastructure in office space. We're lacking the maturity in other industries to call them here. Hopefully as well, the Canadian dollar is weaker than the American dollar, and that might be in our disfavor when we travel, but it can be a powerful incentive for multinational corporations to invest in our city as a more advantage when it comes to cost.
All right. So I sense that this is connected to some of the big projects that the city had approved. When the city voted to approve those 4 capital projects, they did it against the advice of the city's CFO, who said the city could only afford one of them. So if you had been on council, which one of them would you have prioritized? Let me just go through them. The event center with the Calgary Flames, the BMO Center expansion for a new convention space, the Arts Commons transformation, and the Foothills Fieldhouse. Which one do you think is the top priority?
Just looking for the Foothills Fieldhouse is the one by McMahon Stadium, if I'm not mistaken.
I think it's it's up in the north.
Yeah, so honestly, definitely not that one, because I saw the plans presented by Councillor Shahal, and I think they're way too premature. They seem way too. I think they're poor too, based on other designs I've seen of other areas that use that kind of space. So definitely not that one, because it's way too early. It's not thought out. It does not have good integration with the community. So definitely not that one. From your previous interviews that I've followed, I've heard some councillors say that the event center the BMO Center already has part of the funding federally and provincially. So that really helps us manage our budget. We don't have to make as big of a commitment. So I'd probably go with that. It's an easy answer. It's an easy out. I get that. And then a lot of people might want to give my opinion on the arena. I actually like the funding structure of the initial plan, where there was a third the city, a third the Flames organization, and a third the people who use it. Even though I grew up in Calgary, I like hockey, but it's not something that I attend often. So I do think that people who use the space, by having a little additional charge on the ticket, can contribute towards that cost. I like that better. However, I must be honest, the most recent updated agreement, I do like the fact that that the Flames organization has committed to any override costs. If you look at any arena construction in the United States, they've never hit on the dot on what they initially said the cost will be. But a lot of the owners have taken on themselves those override costs, and I think that's an important reason why the new deal makes them more acceptable than what was previously proposed.
All right, perfect. So we've talked a bit about the capital side of the budget. Let's talk about the operating side of the budget. Give me some sense of your approach to looking at the overall budget. Do you think that they're spending about right? Do you think they're spending too much? Do you think they're spending too little?
Yeah, so obviously you can never really get a full picture until you see, the books. But I think, we have what we do have is we have a budget that forces the city to be selective in how much attention it gives to particular areas. And this is a big concern in the Northeast. A lot of people say that, regardless how much we spend, we don't get the same level of service delivery in the Northeast as they might get in the Southwest or the Northwest. So that's way more important to me first. In regards to the costs for like employees and so on, I've been door knocking, and I've actually talked to some workers from the city. What I hear sometimes is a lot of complaints in regards to management, but again, I don't have the raw numbers in front of me to mention that, so I'd have to see that. And some of them have told me that there seems to be a bit of a disconnect between the average worker that works for the city and the management, and how their skills can come intertwined. They feel there's too much direction and not as much work in the field with them to feel like they're like a team and that they're being efficient as they can. And that's something I would definitely look into. But again, I think I will go back to the urban planning point of view. Again, if we keep stretching our resources, if we keep getting too big, we're going to be forced to overtax and overspend because we're going to see these gaps between communities.
Can you talk a bit more about a couple things about where you feel that your community is lacking in amenities and why you feel disadvantaged? That's one. But I'm also wondering if you've heard feedback about the Guidebook for Great Communities, because some of the inner city communities are quite concerned that it's going to change the character of their neighborhood to have large multi-story complexes on what has been a single family home street. And it sounds like you're not as concerned about that, or maybe I'm misunderstanding the approach that you take to densification. But if you could elaborate on that a bit.
For sure. So when it comes to obviously a council does not only vote on the issues in their ward, they vote on the issues in the city. So it's good to be educated on the other topics as well. I think the Guidebook, again, it should be really a case-by-case basis. It was good that the citizen have put more pressure on the current council, because the Guidebook has kind of changed into a more like recommendation, suggestive kind of a framework, where before it seemed to be a bit more poignant and a bit more essential. So that's good. The reason you don't hear it as much in the Northeast is because there are so many new communities, and the developers are actually building homes that are kind of catering to those immigrant communities there and the people who are buying it to their expectation. And again, it's flat. There was nothing previously to there. So you kind of get a blank slate on what gets built in the area. And a lot of families want those bigger homes. There are some issues with that as well, and what's getting built up there. We can talk about that, but that's in the Guidebook question. And your first question was
about amenities, because I've been to Genesee Center, which is fantastic and it's very well attended. I've driven down 17th, and they've got the new BRT. So I recognize that LRT is one issue, but where else is the community lacking in your view? Why do you feel it's disadvantaged?
So for the community space, as you've mentioned. So for example, if you look in the Northeast, anything north of McKnight, which is Ward 5, the only communities that have a community center are Castleridge and Falconridge. Now, I've asked the previous councillor for the area, could you please tell me, sir, how come any of the newer communities north of that don't have any similar space? And what they told me is, well, Tudor, over time, we noticed that there's certain communities that have a very hard time managing the operating costs of a community center. So what they thought would be a good compromise was to build something like the Genesis Center that kind of has this public-private partnership where it operates in multiple ways, but at the same time offers spaces to those community associations. And in this way, you kind of have a multi-purpose space, right? And it allows the finances to work better. Now, I think this is a very good compromise. I have no problem with this idea. However, if you look even further up north in Saddletown, the city has not been able to keep up to its own new standard. And what I mean by that is it has built Skyview, which is a very high density neighborhood, a lot of apartments. It has built Redstone. It's really building up Cityscape and Cornerstone. And there's no facility like that as of yet. I have friends that have bought property there for 10 years, and they've had kids that were 2, 3, 4 years old, and they never had that kind of space. And every time, especially in the winter, when you want to do anything kind of physical activity, you either have to drive to Vivo, which is quite a bit of ways away, or you have to go to Genesis. And the road infrastructure is so poor that your only option is Métis. So you waste a lot of time, and the distance is quite big for you to get there. Now, the current council has approved 5 new facilities, I think at $170 million, the finances. But when they got asked what's the timeline, they said it's 5 to 7 years depending on the project, which shows to me that besides the land and just the commitment, you have not really done that much work on design, location, and everything. So there's going to be people in Skyview and Redstone who are going to have property there for 15 years, and what was promised to them is not being delivered.
Okay.
That's unacceptable. So that's where a lot of apathy comes from.
That helps explain it. Let's talk a little bit, because you'd mentioned about places that you might find efficiencies, and you said you wanted to take a look at management. I just wanted to ask you a couple more questions around taking a role of leadership. Do you think that the council members are fairly compensated, or do you think that we need to look at their level of pay and pension and transition allowances? How would you approach that issue?
No, for sure. I do think we've had, not to name names, but we've had situations where we've seen councillors maybe being a bit abusive of those kind of privileges. And I do think, in my opinion, the wage is quite substantial. There is a bit of a flip side of that coin. The current format that we have today is 14 councillors and 1 mayor. And that was established in 1977. At 1977, our city's population was 600 to 700,000 people, depending how you measure it. And the current population is 1.3 to 1.5, again, depending how you measure it. So we went from one councillor representing 35,000 people to them representing close to 100,000 people. Now, I don't think that necessarily means you have to increase the wages of councillors. I don't think that. But what I think is that their offices and how they can better represent their community needs to be looked at how they do that, because a lot of the amount of apathy I get, especially from second and third generation Canadians in my community, is because of that. Is because they don't feel like their voice is being heard and they're not being engaged in the community. So, and again, this is because of the sprawl. We keep getting better. We're not adjusting to it, and yeah, and it's going to make things more difficult to manage administratively, financially, logistically, and we have to see how big are we going to get? Where do we draw the line?
All right. Let me talk to you a bit about the frontline workers, because when you look at the kind of costs, I mean, you have aspirations to spend a lot more on the capital side. So I'm wondering if there's going to be any savings on the operational side in how you would approach these issues, because we have seen a growth in the number of staff at City Hall. We have also seen that they've signed multi-year collective bargaining agreements. So there's automatic pay increases, even if it's not reflective of the economy. Do you think there needs to be some wage austerity, some wage rollbacks? Do we need to look at how we address the front lines?
I think ideally in moments of economic constriction, we have to, I think depending on what the contracts are and what the conditions are there, because there's obviously a lot of negotiation there. In moments of austerity, at most, I think they should be maybe increased with inflation at most. But we have an opportunity here, and that opportunity is, in every bad there can be some good aspects. And what I mean by this, we've had the COVID pandemic. Hopefully, we're getting to the tail end of that. And actually, the city actually presented a surplus. But a lot of that surplus was because of the transfers from the provincial and the federal governments that it made them on the plus side. We have to look now, as we reopen the economy, reopen the city services, and reopen more facilities, that we don't just turn the dial back up to max, what was previously before, is that we increase incrementally in what the needs are and see where we can operate within maybe a smaller capacity so that we are more efficient. We have to look at that. There might be area that we do need the previous size, but there might be areas where, like, you know what? This period of us having to close down some services has taught us that actually we can run certain things better in a more limited capacity.
Okay, let's talk about taxes. What are you hearing about taxes? Are people concerned about the level, or do they feel like they're getting value for money?
You know what? I haven't heard as much. They're definitely not value for money. Definitely not value for money. And again, I'm sorry to keep going back to this, but again, the city has gotten so big that you have people that live in the edges of the community who sometimes wonder why the taxpayer money goes into projects that are only downtown. And they keep telling me, well, I'm not going to use that. I'm not going to use that facility. Why would I want to contribute a tax? And then just 2 days ago, I talked to a friend who lives in the inner city, and he says, Tudor, you know what? When I look at my property taxes, 50% of my property taxes, they go to all the utilities, sewage, roads, and the new sub communities. And you know what? I want that arena in my community because I use that, right? And this is another question of, like, how do you administer? How do you continue to have a culture where everybody understands that, yes, as taxpayers, we contribute to certain things that we might not use or might underuse or anything like that? And how do we keep that integrated? Because the bigger we get and the bigger we are apart, the more we're going to have kind of these quote unquote regional displeasures about how we spend our money and what projects we do.
What about the business community? Because what we have seen is there's been a couple of tax shifts because downtown is hollowed out. That ended up loading up taxes onto the adjacent communities in the outlying areas. And then those businesses ended up feeling like that was too high a burden. So we have seen an additional tax shift onto residential. How would you approach that issue?
Yeah, so you're definitely right. Ward 5 is extremely lucky because it's such a large immigrant community. A lot of immigrants come very motivated and they start a lot of businesses. Some of them have ethnic component to it, but regardless, they provide a service in the community and to people who live there. And I have heard from some people that they are seeing their property taxes creeping up because our downtown has lost so much of its value. And it's kind of, they kind of have to claw back from these outside of downtown businesses in order to make up that gap. Again, there is no short-term solution for this. Unfortunately, anybody who understands history and understands the incremental progress of policy and the policy lags knows that it would not be possible in 2-3 years. But again, depending how we plan, depending how we build, depending how we incentivize new businesses, especially in downtown and where we smartly place a density, we can improve that tax base without having to stretch the other existing tax contributors.
Okay. Do you think there should be new taxation powers?
Yes, this is a very important question when it comes to the city charters that got struck down by the province. Honestly, I don't think I'm not a tax first. I'm not a tax first type of candidate, or if I were to be elected politician, because last year in the summer, because I couldn't travel internationally, I actually did a cross Canada drive. I drove over 12,000 kilometers and spent 53 days. And I got to see cities like Winnipeg, Montreal, Toronto, all these other provinces that have a PST. And even though they have a PST, and people might say, well, PST is a provincial tax. Yes, but from that provincial tax, cities get certain funding for projects. Those cities have not solved the problems. They have still really poor roads. They still have a big problem with homelessness. The suburbs are just as inadequate when it comes to public spaces. So just because they had this additional tax revenue, in my opinion, from my experience, it did not prove that additional PST solved that problem. I do think we have to look first at an efficiency and management point of view. And only after we do that, and a serious job of that, not just talking about it, then maybe we can look at other alternatives.
All right. So there's a bunch of issues that came up in the last year. So I just want to get your quick response to a few of them, just to see where you stand relative to some of the other candidates who are running. First of all, on the issue of public-private partnerships, there's been discussion about having private delivery of public services, snow clearing, delivery of golf courses, operations, also garbage collection. What's your general approach to that? Do you think that there should be more private sector involvement?
It really depends on, sector to sector. Like if we have a good tradition in the city where we have received good delivery by our public sector service, absolutely we should keep the traditional one if it's a good cost measuring solution. However, like you mentioned, for example, snow clearing, we're abysmal. We're really poor at that. And that's something that we should really looking at more options for public-private partnerships for sure.
Okay, what about the public art program? It's had some controversies, the Big Blue Ring, as well as the Beaufort Towers and a few others. Do you think that they fixed the program, or would you do that differently?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of architecture. So I see art through when people build a building, and that's right, to me, that's a sign of art. I am surprised that I find it sometimes empty that the city will plant a public art object in a place that they have not finished all the other things around it. And that kind of maybe is a small symbolism of the lack of priority and what they should focus on. I like public art, but again, it's not that high up on my list. If I were to see it as being too much push, too much advertised, if it takes so much money and resource, I would push it more down the list because our city lacks infrastructure and services. The public art is it's a way smaller issue in my opinion.
Okay, let me ask you about the defund the police movement that we've heard about in the last year. What does that mean to you, and what lessons do you think we should learn from that?
Yeah, so unfortunately, the way we're so split on certain topics, there's a lot of noise, and you can't really talk about it in a nuanced way. I think there is a good idea to talk about, hey, do we use the Calgary Police Service for certain emergencies or services that we don't need them to?
Mm-hmm.
But I don't agree with the defunding the police. Again, if you just look at the Northeast, and I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to talk about it again, the new Northeast communities, they do not have a police station. The nearest police station is in Saddletown. I have friends who are plumbers who, blue collar workers that really rely on their tools. And he has been robbed at his house. And by the time you call the police from Saddletown, it takes a really long time to get there. So funding the police is not the solution. Again, it's making sure that we plan the city in such a way so all these new communities can have appropriate police service. But yes, there's certain emergencies that sometimes we call the police that maybe we don't. That may be somebody from a more NGO, social service, or a different kind of sector can help with that to reduce and to alleviate the burden on the Calgary Police Service so they can focus on what's really important and what's really dangerous in our communities.
All right. So another policing issue, but from a different perspective, the city made the decision to reduce the speed limits in residential communities down to 40 kilometers per hour. Did you support that move?
I did, actually. The reason is, again, because we've built such a car-centric, road-centric city, we have a lot of Calgarians that drive super fast. And that makes sense when you're on Deerfoot, Stoney, and other places. But we need to have the capacity to realize that as soon as we turn off those big roads, as soon as we turn off McKnight and we get into our neighborhoods, these are shared spaces with pedestrian, cyclists, and anybody else in between, right? And of course, there's a valid point. If we don't enforce the rule, Changing a sign is not going to deter the people that do speed in that community. So we have to have that presence. But the principle itself is not bad. The principle is solid, that within the neighborhoods, we have to drive slower, and that contributes to it. We have to reinforce it, but the principle itself is not bad at all.
Okay, let me ask you a couple of questions related to the role of the council member. You play a role as an elected representative on behalf of your constituents, but sometimes we have direct democratic votes. In the case of the Olympics, for instance, we're going to see a fluoride vote in the fall. We're also going to see a vote on equalization and daylight savings. What's your general view on that? What do you like direct democracy, or would you prefer to make the decisions yourself?
So it's a bit tricky, because the issue is our democracy can be really flawed, because sometimes our direct democracy gets influenced by the constraints of the questions you pose, right? So for example, in the daylight savings time, I heard a very good debate. Why is the daylight savings time the only option we have? Why don't we have standard time, to be in line with BC? Because we've seen that the province to the west side is closer to the BC time zone than that. I'll give you even a bigger example. When I did my cross Canada drive, people might know the city of Thunder Bay. Thunder Bay was initially two cities, of Port Arthur and Fort Williamson. They had two plebiscites because the province wanted to force them to unite. In both plebiscites, Fort Williamson said no. The province eventually said, you know what, guys, we're going to force you guys to unify it anyway. But because we're so nice, we're going to let you pick your name. Do you know what the three options for the name were?
No.
It was Thunder Bay, Lakehead, and the Lakehead. and the final vote, because Lakehead and the Lakehead kind of split the vote on the name, Thunder Bay became the name of the city. So again, I like participative democracy. Switzerland has a very good model. They keep their people exceptionally active, but they have a canton kind of system, so it's a bit different there from a federal point of view. But I like democracy and direct democracy. What I don't like is elected officials constraining the flexibility of that democracy, the option of that democracy with the question. And we can get that, but that's a more provincial issue when we start talking about
it's that. It's a fair point. I think you've answered the question well. Let me just do one last question for you then, because another role that you play is in, you talked about that principal agent role. Sometimes you'll have the city administration that will propose a policy that they think is best for the city as a whole, but your constituents might disagree. What would you do in those cases?
Yes, so this is where I think a counselor plays an important educator role, where they have to provide the information, the resources, and really the community engagement. And one of my critiques or planned critiques for Councillor Shahal was that he always did a very good job of announcing when something got approved, but I thought he was very poor at announcing when something was in that initial process of engaging the community. And if you really think administration is making that good of a point, what they're presenting, it's on you to present the reasoning and the arguments. Now, again, if they don't, you either have to be a good statesman and you'd be like, look, I think this is the right one. If it thinks it hurts my chances to be reelected down the road, I know I'm thinking too much ahead, I'm not even elected. But if you think that much road, you have to own up to your vote, right? And you have to do that. And we don't have that. We have a lot of politicians that smile and they're super nice at the door and they seem very pleasant. But then, like you mentioned in other interviews, you have in-camera discussions, and they're not transparent to the constituents. I would change that. I would be as honest as possible, and again, it would be a tug and war. You're there to educate. You're not there always to agree with your voters. You're not always there to agree with the administration. You're that balancing act, ideally, in that kind of dialogue.
All right. Tell people the best way that they can follow you.
Absolutely. So definitely they can look on my website, www.tudor4ward5.ca. I also have a Facebook page and an Instagram page under the same label, Tudor, the number 4, Ward, and the number 5.
All right. Thank you so much for the conversation today.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your patience and giving me the platform once again.
You got it. That is Tudor Dinca. He is your candidate for Ward 5.